Thank you for joining me. Why is it that our politicians, with so much to be done for the country, seem to have no sense at all of their priorities? The latest folly from Canberra is to hold a referendum. It's to hold a referendum on whether or not to change the oath of allegiance that they swear and to turn this into a pretty useless pledge, a pledge which will have no legal effect. To do this, we need to have a referendum to change the Constitution, and that, unless it's held in association with something else, will cost something like $250 million. This when we have all these problems of this country. Why don't they introduce a real reform? What we should have is something which exists in other countries, and that is the right of the people to recall their politicians to an election. All that happens in these countries is a petition is signed, and if a sufficient percentage of citizens sign that petition, there has to be a recall election. They're not easy to arrange, but they hang over the heads of the politicians so that they become more amenable to being accountable. That's the sort of reform we need, not just changing or taking away their oath of allegiance. In fact, so many of the politicians swear that oath of allegiance to the Queen as Queen of Australia, and then almost immediately afterwards, they tell us that they are Republicans. They mean fake Republicans because none of them, or very few of them, are real Republicans, which means that having sworn an oath of allegiance on the Bible or something similar, we know what everybody suspected. That is, you can't trust their word. When they go into court, for example, and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, I hope some barrister will be asking questions about what they did in relation to their oath of allegiance when they soon renounce that. Well, on Australia Day this year, a shadow assistant minister, released what probably is the policy of the Labor Party, and that is to hold a referendum to change the oath of allegiance. Mr. Thistlethwaite, until 2019, was the shadow assistant minister for an Australian head of state. Shadow assistant minister for an Australian head of state. Well, Mr. Albanese is probably better informed than his predecessor because he knows that with a meticulous press, that leaves him open to ridicule. Because this is a shadow assistant minister for an Australian as head of state, and every Labor government tells the governments of the world that we already have an Australian as head of state, the Governor-General. This happens whenever the Governor-General goes on a state visit. And it was most famously demonstrated in 1987 under the Hawke government when the Governor-General was to go on a state visit to Indonesia. The President Suharto, obviously under the influence of some Republican in the Australian embassy who was wasting the taxpayers' money, President Suharto decided that he wouldn't go to the airport to greet the Governor-General, Sir Ninian Stephen, because he wasn't the head of state. He'd send the Deputy President. So what did Australia do? What did the Hawke government do? They advised the Governor-General to cancel the trip because the Governor-General wasn't being treated as the Australian head of state. Every Australian government, Labor or coalition, knows we have an Australian as head of state. The Governor-General, they tell all other governments and international organisations that this is it. So the leader of the opposition, when he formed his opposition in 2019 and Mr. Shorten stood down as leader of the opposition, Mr. Albanese turned Mr. Thistlethwaite into the Minister for the Republic, Minister or Shadow Minister for the Republic. Trouble is, there isn't a the Republic because they don't know what sort of republic they want. The last time they had a the Republic, when there was an identifiable republic, was in 1999, and that was such a catastrophe in terms of the Constitution that, notwithstanding enormous media support, enormous political support, it was rejected nationally, it was rejected in every state, and in a landslide, it was rejected in 72% of federal electorates. The people certainly said a very big no to that. So they don't have a specific republic, they just have a vague idea of the republic. If they have an idea what the republic is, they're keeping it a secret. In fact, if they went on a demonstration, they marched down the street, they'd be chanting, what do we want? We want a republic, but we haven't the foggiest idea what sort of republic we want. Fortunately, they don't have demonstrations because every demonstration for a republic that's been called has failed because nobody turned up. In fact, the only demonstration in the Republic constitutional monarchy dispute was when Bob Carr threw the governors out of Government House, and Australians, the constitutional monarchy, called a protest, a peaceful protest, in Macquarie Street, and 20,000 Australians turned up. The only demonstration against a republic of any decent size in Australia. Well, Mr. Thistlethwaite not only announced this on Australia Day 2021, he did something which I think is appalling. He announced it when he was invited to speak to new citizens, swearing the pledge to become new citizens of Australia. Now, as anybody would know, that's a day for unity. That's a day for respect for our Constitution, respect for our history, respect for our institutions, and respect for the people who've decided to become Australians. I've been invited to speak on such an occasion. I would never have thought of introducing something political, something divisive. But that's what the Labor Shadow Assistant Minister for the Republic, Matt Thistlethwaite, did. Well, unfortunately for him, on that day, on Australia Day of this year, 2021, as he delivered his speech, his portfolio, that is, his portfolio for the Republic, died under him. The Republic is now dead. It's probably dead and buried, if not comatose. Because that day, the very day, two Republican newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, published the latest Ipsos poll on a republic. And this registered overall support for a republic, any republic, at the lowest it's ever been for Ipsos polls. A mere 34%. And that's before Republicans divide, as they always do, once a specific model is put before them, whether it's an elected presidency, whether it's a presidency appointed by the politicians, they always divide. And a good number of them say, we prefer to stay with what we've got rather than that sort of republic. Interestingly, nobody proposes a real republic like the United States, the main English-speaking republic, the oldest in the world. Nobody proposes a republic like that of Switzerland, where the citizens have much more say than in most other countries. All they do is they propose a fake republic, and that stood out in 1999. But there was something worse, something far worse in that opinion poll, and that was something we've been noticing for a number of years. While the general vote, the overall vote in favour of a republic was 34%, the response among the young, the 18 to 24, was much lower, 24%. Now, if you can't persuade the young of a radical change in your constitution, the young who've been in, let us say, more left-wing education than certainly I had when I was a boy, you can't persuade the young to go along with a republic, then you've got very little chance. This is a time bomb against republic because it was only 24%. Well, the Australian Republican movement, of course, tried to explain all this away. And Mr. Fitzsimons, Mr. Peter Fitzsimons, the head of the Republican movement, he wears the red bandana. Mr. Fitzsimons said, "Oh, that poll is an outlier. That means it failed. It's wrong. It's an outlier." And we had a poll, the YouGov poll, last year, and that showed that 62% of Australians were in favour of becoming a republic. Not exactly, Mr. Fitzsimons, because the question was not, are you in favour of a republic? The question was, do you think Australia should have an Australian as head of state? And the answer was 52% yes, because everybody thinks Australia should have an Australian as head of state. Monarchists think that too. And when they took away the don't knows, this went up to 62% saying they thought Australia should have an Australian as head of state. As I do. As we have. That was what's wrong with that opinion poll. The question was deceitful. The question was about something which was in issue in the referendum, because Australians, a constitutional monarchy, were saying, we've already got an Australian as head of state. And to put that as the question in a referendum is completely wrong. And it didn't mention whether we were to become a republic or not. So it was a completely useless opinion poll, probably commissioned by somebody who wanted that answer. Well, both Australians were constitutional monarchy, and all governments say we have an Australian as head of state. Why do the Republicans go into this? It's because every other reason they give for spending an enormous amount of money in making this change to the Constitution is not to improve the governance of Australia. It's to throw money down the drain. And on the last occasion, it was to give you a politician's republic, a republic more under the control of the politicians than it already has. And I would think that most Australians would say the politicians have made such a mess of the governance of this country, why increase the power they have? Surely, instead of pushing something clearly the people don't want, the people are not interested in, why aren't the politicians doing those things which they should be doing to improve this country? Providing water, for example, cheap electricity, stopping what they've done for so many years, making us dependent on the People's Republic of China. The politicians really have to lift their game. And the only way that that can happen is by giving the people more power over the politicians. So this proposal to change the oath of allegiance with a referendum to do that is a complete waste of time. It would be a complete waste of money. The politicians really ought to just improve their actions and stop making a mess of the governance of this country. Australians, fellow Australians, it's time to take back your country.